night was thick with silence. Not the ordinary kind of silence you hear when the world goes to sleep. This was different. It was heavy, suffocating, and somewhere in that darkness, something was breathing. Stormy Daniels had been through her share of strange situations in life. She was used to chaos, used to the limelight, used to people talking about her. But nothing had prepared her for what she was about to see inside that old New Orleans home. It started with small things. A flicker of movement just out of the corner of her eye. A strange chill in the air, even when the summer heat outside was unbearable. And then, the night she would never forget, when she came face to face with something that, in her own words, was not human. This isn't just another celebrity ghost story. This is the account of a woman who looked straight into the darkness and saw it looking back. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was holding its breath. New Orleans had always carried an energy unlike anywhere else. A strange mix of beauty and menace that seemed to seep into its streets and buildings. Stormy Daniels had moved there hoping for a quieter life, away from the glare of cameras and headlines. But the city had a way of offering more than you asked for. The house she bought was old, beautiful in its own decaying way, with wooden floors that groaned under each step and windows that rattled in the wind. She liked that about it, felt alive. But soon, she began to suspect it was alive in ways she couldn't explain. At first, it was just the little things. A mug she'd left on the counter showing up on the opposite side of the kitchen. Doors that she was certain she had closed swinging open again. She brushed it off as forgetfulness or the quirks of an aging home. But then came the night in the kitchen. She had been rinsing a glass when, out of nowhere, a crushing sadness gripped her chest. It wasn't hers. It felt alien, invasive, like someone had poured their grief straight into her soul. Her eyes burned and filled with tears for no reason she could understand. She stepped back from the sink, heart racing, looking into the empty space in front of her as if expecting to see someone standing there. The feeling passed, but it left her shaken. Later, she would hear rumors that a woman had once lived in the house, a mother who had lost her child and never recovered. People whispered that her spirit was still there, clinging to the kitchen as if afraid to leave the place where her life had broken. Upstairs, there was an old mirror, the kind that looked like it had been around for over a century. She had kept it in the bedroom because it fit the antique style of the house, but every time she walked past it, she felt a strange pull, like someone was on the other side watching her. It wasn't always a threatening feeling. In fact, sometimes she even felt oddly comforted by it, as if whatever presence lingered there was protective. She later learned the mirror had belonged to a woman who had worked as a sex worker in the area long ago. That woman had died in tragic circumstances, but her spirit, for some reason, had not moved on. Stormy couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit saw a reflection of herself in her, and that was why it stayed close. But the comfort was only part of the story. There was something else in that house, something not human, not gentle, and certainly not interested in friendship. The first time she sensed it, she was in the living room late at night, idly strumming a guitar. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Without warning, the strings of the guitar began to tighten under her fingers, as if invisible hands were pulling them. Then, with a sharp snap, one string broke, whipping against her hand so hard it left a red mark. She froze, the sound of the broken string still ringing in her ears. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, just the oppressive, heavy feeling that something was there with her. That was the first time she thought of leaving, but she didn't. Curiosity and stubbornness kept her in that house. It was weeks later when she saw it. She had been asleep, or at least drifting close to it, when a sound woke her. It wasn't a creak or a bang. It was breathing. Low, slow, and too close. Her body tensed as her eyes adjusted to the dim light in the room. That's when she saw movement at the far corner. Something was shifting in the shadows, sliding closer. The shape was wrong for a human. It was low, hunched, and seemed to ripple as it moved. Her mind struggled to make sense of it until a part of it emerged into the faint light. A long, slick appendage, almost like a tentacle curling upward as if testing the air. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to sit up, but it was like the air around her had turned solid. The thing's presence filled the room, cold and electric, and she could feel it pressing into her thoughts, as if it was trying to get inside her mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it slid back into the shadows and was gone. She lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to close her eyes, every nerve in her body screaming to run. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream, but deep down she knew it hadn't been. Over the following nights, she felt it again. Sometimes in the corner of her vision, sometimes in the feeling of something brushing against her leg when she was alone. The spirits of the woman in the mirror and the grieving mother in the kitchen had never frightened her the way this thing did. They were human once. This thing never had been. Stormy began to keep a journal of the events, writing down every odd occurrence, every moment that felt wrong. She spoke to locals, people who knew the history of the neighborhood, and heard stories of the land the house sat on. Stories of dark rituals, of things summoned that were never sent back. She wondered if her presence there had drawn it out, or if it had simply been waiting for someone new to notice it. Either way, the house was no longer just a place to live. It had become a battlefield between the living, the dead, and something far older than either. And in the still hours of the night, when the world was silent and her house seemed to breathe, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in the shadows was not finished with her yet. The first few days inside the old New Orleans house felt deceptively calm. Stormy kept herself busy unpacking boxes, arranging the kitchen, and admiring the antique crown molding that curved along the ceilings like delicate lace frozen in wood. Yet every so often, she caught herself pausing, listening. It was never loud, just faint creaks in the hallway when no one was there, or the sense that the air in certain rooms felt thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were quietly exhaling. On the fourth night, after an exhausting day of cleaning, she collapsed onto her couch, only to notice a slow, deliberate shadow move across the opposite wall. Her first instinct was to blame the street lamps outside, but when she checked the blinds, they were fully shut. The shadow had no source. She didn't tell anyone. Over the next week, her cat began acting strangely. Normally calm, it would suddenly leap up, ears flat, staring at the empty corner near the staircase as if something invisible stood there. One night, the animal hissed so violently that it backed away, claws digging into the hardwood, never taking its eyes off the darkness above the first landing. Stormy tried to laugh it off, but her skin prickled. It was just a cat, she told herself. But deep down, she already knew the house carried something older than her presence. The real breaking point began on a humid summer evening. She had fallen asleep with the TV still on, the soft glow painting the walls in dull flickers. At exactly 2:17 a.m., she woke to a pressure on her chest. Not heavy enough to suffocate, but solid enough to make her breath catch. The air was damp and cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin and stays there. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to respond. It was as if her muscles had been pinned down by something unseen. Her eyes darted toward the corner of the room, and that's when she saw it. A shape began to take form. First a shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt, then a dark, twisting figure with limbs that were too long, too jointless to be human. It moved without sound, gliding forward with an unnatural fluidity. What terrified her most wasn't just its alien appearance. It was the feeling that it had been here before, waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself. As it reached the edge of the bed, something coiled around her ankle. Not rough, not smooth, something alive. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped inside her chest. The thing leaned in closer. It had no face, yet she could feel its attention on her, as if it were studying her reactions. The grip around her ankle tightened, and from somewhere behind her came the faintest sound, 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the wooden headboard. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the weight lifted. The figure dissolved into the air like smoke in a gust, leaving only the faint scent of something metallic, like rust or blood. She sat up, gasping for air, clutching her legs to her chest. Her first thought was to check the door locked. Every window latched, yet the feeling of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. She turned the TV back on, letting the noise fill the silence, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. For the rest of the night, she didn't dare close her eyes. Days later, while filming in her home for an unrelated project, Stormy mentioned the incident casually to a friend on set. The friend froze, eyes widening. "You know this place has a history, right?" they asked. Stormy shook her head. According to them, the property had been built on land that once housed a boarding school in the late 1800s, a place with its own record of mysterious disappearances and whispered tragedies. The friend didn't elaborate, but their expression was enough to send a shiver crawling down Stormy's spine. Still, she wasn't ready to admit the house was haunted. That changed one quiet afternoon when she decided to nap on the couch. The guitar that sat in the corner, a vintage instrument she rarely touched, suddenly snapped a string with a sharp, violent twang. Startled, she sat up, but what she saw froze her in place. The guitar's body was slowly spinning on its stand, as if something had brushed past it. There was no wind, no one else in the house, just her, and whatever shared the space. The strangest part was how the energy in the house seemed to shift depending on where she was. The kitchen felt oddly alive, as if someone invisible busied themselves with tasks. Drawers opening slightly, cupboard doors left ajar when she knew she'd closed them. Upstairs, the mirror in the guest room reflected more than it should. She began noticing small discrepancies, her reflection not matching her movements for a split second. The faint blur of another figure standing just behind her shoulder, gone the instant she turned. By now, the fear wasn't just in her head. It had settled in her body, her routines, even her sleep. She kept the lights on in multiple rooms at night, left music playing on low volume, anything to make the house feel less silent. Yet no matter what she did, there were moments when she would catch herself holding her breath without realizing it, because somewhere deep inside, she was listening again. And sometimes, in that brittle, watchful quiet, she could hear the faintest sound of footsteps moving across the floor upstairs. She would lie in bed, staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, her ears straining for the faintest hint of movement. Sometimes it was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the floorboards above her. Except there was no upstairs, just an attic that had been locked for decades. Other nights, it was the sensation of a faint pressure against the mattress, as though someone or something was sitting at the foot of her bed, watching her. Stormy would tell herself it was her imagination, the residue of a long day's work or a mind half lost to insomnia. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't normal. The air in the house seemed heavier at night, thick enough to make every breath feel like dragging smoke into her lungs. One evening, while sorting through boxes in a dimly lit corner of the living room, Stormy found a small, dust-caked mirror propped up against the wall. The glass was streaked and warped, the kind of old that felt older than the building itself. When she looked into it, the reflection didn't match her movements perfectly. There was a faint lag, a delay, like an old video buffering. She blinked hard, blaming fatigue, and shoved the mirror back into storage. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something on the other side had been staring back. The turning point came late one humid night. Stormy was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of lukewarm coffee, scrolling through her phone. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, something pale, smooth, and impossibly long, sliding across the tiled floor. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from the street lamp outside. But then it uncoiled. The thing was like a tentacle, glistening as though coated in a film of slime, writhing silently toward the hallway. It vanished before she could fully process what she was seeing. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she told herself she'd imagined it. But the wet, faintly briny smell it left behind told her otherwise. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house was an accusation. Every shadow in the corner of her vision seemed to stretch into something inhuman. The next day, she tried to tell a friend about it, someone who knew her well enough not to laugh off her fears. But even as she described the incident, she could hear how crazy it sounded. The friend just nodded politely, then changed the subject. That's when Stormy realized she was alone in this, whatever this was. Weeks passed, and the occurrences grew bolder. She would hear a faint plucking sound from the living room, only to find her guitar leaning against the wall, a single string vibrating wildly as if it had just been struck. One night, she awoke to a sharp, resonant snap. When she turned on the light, she found the guitar lying on the floor, its neck splintered clean in two. The break was too precise to be an accident. The wood fibers looked torn apart, as if by an immense, deliberate force. There were cold spots too, pockets of frigid air that would suddenly form around her, so icy they made her breath visible, even in the sweltering Louisiana summer. In those moments, her skin prickled with the unmistakable sense of being watched. Sometimes, she would feel a faint brushing against her arm, almost tender, like someone running their fingertips along her skin. Other times, the touch was rough, a sudden shove that left her stumbling. It wasn't just Stormy who noticed. On two separate occasions, guests in her home mentioned seeing a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, tall, impossibly still, and shrouded in darkness. When they looked directly at it, the figure would vanish, but the heavy, oppressive feeling it brought would linger for hours. Her dreams began to twist. She'd find herself wandering through the house, only it wasn't quite her house. It was decayed, the walls dripping with moisture, the floors covered in a thin layer of stagnant water. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the faint sound of something breathing, slow and labored, like the lungs of a sleeping beast. In one dream, she approached the attic door and found it standing wide open. The smell that poured out was so vile it made her gag, but still she climbed the stairs. At the top, a mirror waited for her, larger than the one she'd found before. This time, her reflection smiled back at her, but her own mouth had not moved. Stormy started to keep a journal of the incidents, hoping that writing them down would help her make sense of them. But the entries began to disturb her. There were notes in handwriting she didn't recognize, scrawled in the margins. Strange symbols, rough sketches of eyes and coiled shapes, and phrases she didn't remember writing, like, "It's under the floor," and "Don't let it out." She would wake to find the journal lying open on her nightstand, a new page filled in, despite locking it away the night before. One night, she woke to the faint sound of water dripping. She followed it to the kitchen, where she found a puddle forming on the floor. She looked up to see water seeping through the ceiling, even though it hadn't rained in days. She climbed the attic stairs, her bare feet sticking slightly to the damp wood. At the top, she found the source, a dark pool of water collecting in the center of the attic floor. The air was freezing, her breath puffing out in white clouds. In the middle of the water stood a shape, tall, thin, and impossibly black, as though it absorbed all the light around it. Its head tilted slowly, acknowledging her, and then it stepped forward. The water rippled, and a long, glistening tentacle slid toward her across the floor. The strange sounds escalated into a rhythm, as though someone were deliberately pacing from one corner of the room to the other. Stormy's pulse quickened, the hair on her arms rising in the thick air. She pulled the blanket closer to her chin, listening intently. Then, out of the shadows, a peculiar sensation washed over her. Not a sound, not a sight, but a deep, crawling awareness that she was being observed. She told herself it was the creaks of an old house, the settling of the floorboards, but her body knew otherwise. The air itself seemed to have weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath feel labored. Somewhere to her left, the floor groaned under an unseen weight, followed by the faint but unmistakable drag of something across the wooden boards. Her eyes darted to the dark space near the window, and for a split second, she thought she saw movement. A slithering, fluid shift, as though the shadows themselves had rippled. The logical part of her brain screamed to turn on the lamp, but the other half, the one gripped by primal fear, convinced her that if she moved, she'd draw its full attention. She stayed frozen, her gaze locked on that patch of darkness, until the air shifted, carrying a faint, wet sound, almost like the suction of something pulling free from a surface. Stormy's heart hammered in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping the act of ignoring it would make it vanish. But then came the whisper, low, guttural, and in no language she understood. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming across the bed, the terror of the night before still fresh in her mind. She convinced herself it had been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. But when she swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet met with something damp. Looking down, she saw faint, wet trails across the hardwood floor, winding from the far corner of the room toward her bed. She followed them with her eyes, her stomach churning, until they disappeared under the frame. Kneeling, she peered into the darkness beneath, only to find nothing. No intruder, no creature, only the strange lingering scent of brine, sharp and out of place in the dry morning air. She tried to shake it off. Over the next few days, life went on, but the house never quite felt normal. Doors that she swore she had closed would stand ajar when she returned. Lights flickered without reason, the bulbs themselves perfectly fine. At night, she'd sometimes hear the distant sound of strings plucked from somewhere in the house, like an instrument being played far away. She remembered she owned an old acoustic guitar, a relic from years past, resting on a stand in the living room. Stormy began to wonder if perhaps it was just her mind conjuring these disturbances out of a subconscious need for excitement. But everything changed the evening she decided to stay up late, working on her laptop in the living room. The guitar sat in the corner, silent as ever. The clock read just past midnight when the temperature dropped abruptly, a chill so sharp it made her breath visible. She wrapped herself in a blanket, glancing toward the corner where the guitar rested. Without warning, one of its strings twanged sharply, the sound slicing through the silence. She froze, watching, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows. Then, before her eyes, the neck of the guitar twisted violently, as though gripped by invisible hands, and the wood cracked with a deafening snap. The instrument collapsed in on itself, the pieces skidding slightly across the floor. Her scream echoed through the empty rooms, but no one came. She backed away, her mind unable to process what she'd seen. She grabbed her keys and left the house, sitting in her car under the streetlight for nearly an hour before daring to return. When she finally stepped back inside, the guitar was gone. The corner where it had stood was bare, the only sign of its existence the faint indentation in the carpet. She never found the pieces. That night, she barely slept, every sound amplified into a possible threat. Somewhere in the depths of the house, faint and deliberate, came the sound of footsteps again, moving not above, but directly behind her bedroom wall. Stormy lay in bed that night with every nerve in her body on edge, her ears tuned to the faintest shift in the silence. The footsteps behind the wall were slow and deliberate, pausing every few seconds, almost as if the thing, whatever it was listening for her reaction. She held her breath, the pounding of her heart sounding deafening in her own ears. The space between her and the wall suddenly felt thinner, as though the barrier of wood and plaster wasn't solid enough to keep it out. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, thinking of calling someone, but a strange static hiss crackled through the speaker before she even unlocked it. Her hand froze, the screen dimmed by itself, and for a split second, her reflection in the glass wasn't her own. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth curved in a grin far too wide for any human face. She flung the phone onto the bed and sat up, ready to bolt from the room, but the temperature dropped again, sucking the warmth out of the air so fast it felt like she had stepped into a freezer. Then came the sound, the faint scraping, like fingernails dragging down the inside of the wall, moving closer to where her head had been resting. She backed toward the doorway, every muscle tight, when a hollow thud came from the closet. Stormy's eyes locked on the thin wooden door. It rattled once, twice, then stopped, leaving only the suffocating quiet. She was shaking, but some stubborn instinct made her want to see. She reached for the closet door handle with trembling fingers, pulling it open in one swift motion. The closet was empty except for her clothes, which swayed gently as though something had just brushed past them. The scent hit her next, salt water, thick and nauseating, like a pier at low tide. She stepped back, her hand instinctively covering her nose, but before she could shut the door, something shifted in the darkness between the hanging coats. A shape leaned forward, impossibly tall, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows. The only detail she could make out was the glint of something wet dripping from where a face should have been. She slammed the door shut and bolted from the room, racing down the hallway barefoot, the boards cold and unforgiving beneath her feet. In the living room, she grabbed her purse and car keys, her hands fumbling in panic. She didn't care about packing anything. She just needed to get out. But as she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The lock turned easily, but the door felt as though it had been glued in place. She yanked harder, her breath coming in quick gasps, and that was when she heard it. The soft click of bare feet stepping onto the hardwood behind her. Stormy's head turned slowly, her vision swimming with dread. The hallway she had just come from was darker than before, a solid wall of black where the faint night light should have been glowing. And out of that darkness came the wet, deliberate sound of something moving closer. Her survival instinct kicked in. She darted toward the back of the house, toward the sliding glass door that led to the yard. The curtains there hung perfectly still, untouched by any breeze, and she yanked them open with desperate force. What she saw on the other side made her stumble back. The yard, her fence, the neighbors' porch lights, gone. In their place was a black expanse of still, oily water that stretched endlessly in every direction, reflecting no stars, no moon. It lapped soundlessly at the threshold, and the smell of salt and decay hit her so hard it made her gag. She turned to run again, but the sound behind her had grown louder, closer. Her feet barely made contact with the floor as she sprinted down the hall toward her bedroom, thinking maybe she could climb out the window. She burst inside and grabbed at the frame, But before she could open it, she felt it. Ice-cold fingers wrapping around her ankle. The grip was inhumanly strong, pulling her back with a single jarring yank. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the hand didn't let go. She caught a glimpse of it in the dim light. A long, slick limb ending in fingers far too long. The skin pale and stretched, glistening as though it had just emerged from deep water. Her nails scraped against the floor as she tried to claw herself forward. But then the wall behind her closet cracked with a deafening snap, with splintering outward as something began to force its way into the room. A shape emerged, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its face, or what passed for one, was smooth, featureless except for a jagged vertical split down the center. That split opened like a mouth, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The stench of brine and rot flooded the room as it let out a low, gurgling sound, the kind of noise one might hear from something drowning or dragging itself out of the depths. Stormy's vision blurred as her pulse roared in her ears. She lashed out one last time, managing to wrench her ankle free and scramble onto the bed. She grabbed the lamp from her nightstand and hurled it toward the thing. It shattered against its shoulder, spraying shards of glass across the floor, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head in a disturbingly curious motion, like it was studying her. Then, in one swift movement, it lunged forward, and the world went black. When she woke, the room was bathed in morning light. Everything was as it had been. The guitar gone, the closet closed, the floor spotless. But her ankle ached, and when she rolled up her pajama leg, she saw the imprint of long, bony fingers bruised into her skin. She never told anyone about that night, not really. But she never returned to that house either. And sometimes, even years later, when she was lying awake in the stillness of a hotel room, she swore she could smell the faint scent of salt water creeping back into the air. The following night, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing against her skin. She had planned to go to bed earlier, hoping that maybe rest would clear her mind. But as the clock struck midnight, she found herself wide awake. The television in the living room flickered once before shutting off completely, even though the rest of the house still had power. Stormy walked over to the switch, flicking it on and off, but the TV stayed black. Then, faintly, from somewhere upstairs, came the soft sound of a guitar string being plucked. Not strummed, not played, just a single note. She froze, the echo carrying down the stairwell in a way that felt deliberate, as though it was meant for her ears alone. Her eyes scanned the shadows that pooled at the edges of the room, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. She decided to confront it. Moving toward the stairs, each step creaked under her weight. The air grew colder with every foot she climbed. Halfway up, the plucking stopped, replaced by the sound of something faintly scratching against a wall. She reached the top landing and turned toward the guest room, the source of the sound. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came a faint glow, like moonlight but somehow dimmer, more unnatural. Pushing the door open, she found the guitar leaning against the wall. One of its strings hung loose, swaying gently as if recently snapped. She reached for it, but the moment her fingers touched the wood, the closet door in the corner swung open with violent force. Inside the closet was only darkness, pitch black in a way that didn't seem possible. She couldn't see the back wall, just an endless void. And then, slowly, something moved inside. She couldn't tell if it was a shadow or if the shadow itself was alive. Two shapes, like limbs, stretched forward, gripping the frame of the closet. They didn't look human. Too long, too jointed, bending in ways they shouldn't. She stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the doorframe. The thing stepped forward, but the moment its body began to emerge, the hallway light flickered violently, and in that strobe of illumination, it was gone. Stormy's breath was ragged. She could still smell it, an acrid, briny scent, like seawater left to rot. It was the same smell from her nightmare, the one with the tentacle creature. She backed away, slamming the guest room door shut, but the sound that followed was worse than anything yet. From inside the room came a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Then silence. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, waiting for the sun to rise. But when morning came, she noticed something strange. Muddy footprints leading from the front door to the stairs, and then disappearing halfway up. She lived alone. No one else had a key. Over the next few days, things escalated. Lights would turn on in rooms she hadn't entered. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night, and the guitar, now missing its snapped string, kept showing up in different places. Sometimes she'd find it in the hallway, other times leaning against her bed. Each time, the loose string would be swaying, as though someone had just touched it. Friends she invited over would make excuses to leave early, claiming the house felt wrong. One even swore she saw a shadow move across the ceiling, although there was nothing above them but the attic. Stormy stopped trying to rationalize it. She knew something had taken an interest in her, and it wasn't about to leave anytime soon. The nights grew longer, or maybe it was just her mind stretching time into something unbearable. Stormy had stopped sleeping in her bedroom entirely. Instead, she camped out on the living room couch with every lamp on, the TV playing static in the background just for the noise. But the thing, whatever it was, didn't seem to care about lights or sound. Came when it wanted, and it made sure she knew it. On the 4th night of this self-imposed exile to the couch, she woke to a sound that wasn't part of the TV's static. It was wet, dripping, a slow, steady plink, 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 as though water was falling from a great height onto something hollow. Her first thought was a leak in the ceiling, but as she looked up, the plaster above her was dry. Still, the sound persisted, and it was getting closer. She sat up, scanning the room, and that's when she saw it. From the far corner of the ceiling, a thin, dark liquid was creeping along the plaster like veins spreading under skin. The drip was coming from where it met the wall, each droplet splattering onto the hardwood floor and leaving small, black stains. Her chest tightened, breath coming in short bursts. Without realizing it, she whispered into the empty room, "What do you want?" The moment the words left her mouth, the TV's static cut out. Silence. A thick, oppressive silence that seemed to press into her ears. And then, from behind her, far too close, a voice answered. It wasn't a voice meant for human ears. It was layered, guttural, like something speaking from under deep water and through a mouth that had never formed words before. The only part she could make out clearly was, "I've been here." She turned sharply, heart slamming in her chest. Nothing was there, but in the reflection of the darkened TV screen, she saw movement. A shape looming behind her, tall enough that its head brushed the ceiling. Its arms, or what she thought were arms, hung low, tapering into thin, whip-like ends that twitched and coiled slowly, like snakes tasting the air. She spun around to face it, but the room was empty. The reflection, however, lingered in the glass for several seconds after. That was when she decided to leave the house. She grabbed her phone, her bag, her car keys. She didn't even bother with shoes. Fumbling at the lock, she yanked the front door open and froze. It was there, not in the reflection, not in a shadow, right in front of her, filling the porch with its impossible size. Its body was a mass of shifting black, like ink suspended in water, forming and reforming tentacles that slithered along the walls and railing. Its head, or what she assumed was its head, had no face, only a gaping circular maw lined with teeth that spiraled inward. The smell hit her like a punch. Salt, rot, and something old, something ancient. The tentacles curled around the doorway, blocking her escape. She couldn't even scream, her throat locked up in pure, primal terror. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it began to dissolve. Not vanish, dissolve like the air was eating it away piece by piece. Within seconds, there was nothing there but the night air and the faint sound of the ocean. Even though she lived miles from the shore, she stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for breath, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But when she looked down, she saw the wood was slick with seawater, and across it, faintly glowing in the dark, were wet prints shaped like nothing she'd ever seen before. Stormy didn't sleep that night. She drove aimlessly through the dark, from one gas station to another, from empty parking lots to all-night diners. Every time she stopped somewhere quiet, she swore she could hear that slow, rhythmic dripping again, even when there was no water around. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, her nerves were raw. She didn't want to go back to the house, but every mile she put between herself and it felt useless, like the thing wasn't bound to the property at all. Around sunrise, she pulled over at a small roadside motel, the kind where the neon vacancy sign flickered in the morning light. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when Stormy handed over her card and mumbled for a room. She collapsed onto the bed without even pulling back the sheets, still in her jeans and jacket. For a moment, she thought exhaustion would finally force her into sleep. But then the smell hit her. Salt, rot, that same old, impossible scent that had made her gag the night before. She sat bolt upright. The motel room was empty, the curtains pulled tight, no sign of movement. Yet she could hear it again. Blink, blink, blink. The sound was coming from the bathroom. Against every instinct, she crept toward it. The door was cracked open just enough for her to see the sink inside. It was full of black. Bathroom. Against every instinct, she crept toward it. The door was cracked open just enough for her to see the sink inside. It was full of black water, the surface trembling as though something beneath it was moving. Slowly, a shape began to rise from the water. First a thin, bony hand, its skin stretched too tight over the joints, the nails jagged and broken. Then another, and then that maw, that spiraling, teeth-lined mouth forcing its way through the tiny basin, as if the sink were just a doorway too small for what wanted to come through. She stumbled back, knocking over the motel's cheap lamp. The thing moved faster than it had at the house, like it knew she was weaker now, more tired, easier prey. Its arms shot out of the sink, impossibly long, snatching at her. She bolted for the door, flinging it open, and tore across the parking lot. But no matter how fast she ran, the sound followed. Blink, blink. She reached her car, fumbling with the keys, when she saw the reflection in the window, its shifting, ink-black form already right behind her, towering over the hood. In that moment, Stormy realized something she'd been trying to deny. It wasn't haunting her house. It was haunting her. She jumped into the car, slammed the lock, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the empty lot, but the creature didn't flee. It stood there in the beams, its body rippling like it was made of water and shadow, its maw opening wider and wider until the edges blurred. And then, without moving, it spoke again in that layered, drowning voice. "You can't run." The windshield glass trembled, frost spreading across it even though the air was warm. Stormy's hands shook on the wheel. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even know if there was anywhere she could go. But she put the car in gear and drove because the only other option was to stop, and she knew if she stopped, it would take her. Stormy drove for hours, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, the sky turning from pale gold to a blinding midday blue. She hadn't eaten, hadn't even taken a sip of water. Her hands were cramped around the steering wheel, knuckles pale. Every so often, she glanced into the rearview mirror, not for other cars, but for it. By the time she reached the outskirts of a small desert town, her gas tank was nearly empty. The place looked half dead. A few boarded-up shops, a diner with a crooked open sign, and an old church whose bell tower leaned slightly as if tired. Stormy pulled into the diner's gravel lot, too desperate to care if the thing was still behind her. Inside, the diner was almost empty. An old man sat at the counter, sipping coffee, while a waitress wiped down the far tables. Stormy took a seat, and when the waitress asked what she wanted, she could barely speak. "Water," she whispered. "And do you have a phone book?" The waitress blinked but returned a minute later with both. Stormy flipped through until she found a page for paranormal and occult. There was only one listing: Madame Eleanor, Reader of Truths. She didn't hesitate. The address turned out to be a dusty trailer at the edge of town. A hand-painted sign leaned against it, letters faded by sun and wind. Stormy knocked, and the door opened almost instantly, as if the woman inside had been waiting for her. Madame Eleanor was small, her gray hair pulled into a loose braid, eyes sharp as if they could peel back skin and see what pulsed underneath. "You've brought something with you," Eleanor said before Stormy could speak. Stormy's throat tightened. "You can see it?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Not see. Feel. It's old. Older than language. It found you because you were open." "I didn't invite it," Stormy started, but Eleanor cut her off. "You don't have to. Sometimes, the wound in your life is enough of an invitation." They sat at a small round table. Eleanor lit a candle, the flame guttering like it was breathing. "Tell me everything," she said. Stormy told her about the sound, the smell, the thing in the water. Eleanor listened, never interrupting. When Stormy was finished, Eleanor reached beneath the table and pulled out a worn leather-bound book. She flipped through its pages until she stopped on an illustration that made Stormy's skin crawl. It was exactly what she'd seen in her bathroom sink. The maw, the hands, the water-rippled body. Beneath the drawing, in cramped ancient script, was a single word: Nareth. Eleanor spoke the name like it was a curse. A hunter. It doesn't kill for hunger. Kills for memory. Keeps pieces of those it takes. Stormy's stomach turned. "How do I get rid of it?" Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "You don't. You run. Or you give it something it wants more than you." The candle flame suddenly stretched tall, wavering violently as if something had brushed past. Eleanor's eyes widened. "It's here." The air in the trailer grew thick, heavy. From the tiny bathroom down the hall came the sound of dripping water. Blink, blink. Stormy's pulse pounded in her ears. She stood, but Eleanor grabbed her arm. "You have to choose now. Someone else, or you." The dripping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right beside her. She could smell the salt and rot again. And from the corner of the trailer, in the shadow where no light reached, the maw began to open. Stormy realized whatever she chose, someone was going to be gone before sunset. Stormy's breath came in ragged bursts as the black shape swelled from the corner, its surface shimmering like oil, edges dripping into the floor as though it were melting reality itself. The maw widened, and inside she could see faces, pale, drowned, staring with eyes full of pleading. Some she didn't recognize. Others, she swore she had seen in dreams she thought were just nightmares. Eleanor's grip on her arm was fierce. "Look at me," she hissed. "It can only take what you give it willingly." "That makes no sense," Stormy said, her voice breaking. "It's already here. It's already taking." But Eleanor shook her head. If it came this close, it's because you've been feeding it without knowing. Fear, tension, memory. Every time you replayed that night at the hotel, every time you imagined what it looked like, you made it stronger. You invited it deeper. Stormy's knees felt like they'd collapse. Then what the hell do I do? The old woman's eyes softened for a moment, almost pitying. Either you starve it, or you give it something better than yourself. Before Stormy could reply, Eleanor turned toward the shadow and began speaking in a language Stormy had never heard. The dripping sound became a rush, like a wave smashing against rocks, filling the trailer. The thing shifted, its attention drawn entirely to Eleanor. Stormy realized, with sickening clarity, what was happening. Eleanor was offering herself. No! Stormy lunged forward, but the psychic pressure in the room shoved her back against the wall. She could barely move as Eleanor's words grew louder, more urgent. The shadow surged forward, engulfing her in one smooth motion. There was no scream, just silence, and then the faint smell of sea brine. The maw lingered, staring at Stormy with something that might have been satisfaction, or hunger still unsated. Then, without a sound, it folded into itself and vanished, leaving only the guttering candle and the cold. Stormy stood there for what felt like hours, unable to breathe properly, the room spinning around her. She finally stumbled outside into the blinding desert sun. The trailer behind her looked exactly the same, except the sign with Eleanor's name was gone, as though it had never been there. For days, she drove aimlessly, afraid to stop, afraid to sleep. She told herself it was over, that Eleanor's sacrifice had worked. But deep down, she knew better. It happened on the fourth night. She woke in her motel room to the sound of dripping water. The bathroom light was on, the door slightly ajar. When she pushed it open, the sink was overflowing. And in the mirror, just over her shoulder, the maw began to open again. The mirror's surface shimmered like a dark lake, the ripples distorting Stormy's reflection. Her own eyes stared back, except they weren't her eyes. They were black, depthless, glistening like wet stone. Behind her, the motel room was gone. In its place stretched an endless shoreline under a sky that churned with storm clouds. The air smelled of salt and decay. The waves rolled in unnaturally slow, each one bringing with it fragments of things. Broken chairs, tattered shoes, bones worn smooth by the water. And far out at sea, rising from the horizon, was the maw. But this time it wasn't reaching for her. It was waiting. She heard a voice then, not Eleanor's voice exactly, but close, warmer, almost familiar. "You called me," it said gently. "You've always called me." Stormy's chest tightened. You're not Eleanor." The voice chuckled softly. "Eleanor was the part of me you could accept, but you've been feeding me since long before you met her. Every dream, every whispered fear in the dark, you kept the door open." The water at her feet was rising now, licking at her ankles. In the reflection, she saw not herself, but the countless pale faces she'd glimpsed before. Faces turning toward her in silent expectation. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The voice seemed to curl around her mind like smoke. "Not you, Stormy. I want what you want. The truth. The story. The one no one else dares tell. But the truth has a price." She felt herself step forward without willing it, into the icy water. The tide pulled gently at her, as if guiding her toward the horizon. The last thing she saw before the reflection dissolved was her own mouth in the mirror, smiling. And then the world went black. Somewhere in the distance, the dripping began again.